Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video for History Vibe Podcast. Today I'm joined by Professor Bartosz Adamczewski, and today he's going to be discussing the Gospel of Mark's knowledge of Josephus. And since he dates Mark after Josephus and also the other Gospels after Mark, he believes that all four Gospels know the work of Josephus. So we're going to be focusing more on Mark's knowledge of Josephus. Yeah, that being said, Bartosz, welcome back to the show.
hmm Uh, yes, thank you for this introduction. Thank you very much.
Hmm.
And it's really good to see you here and to also to have our viewers. The topic is very, very important because it's crucial for the dating of the Gospels. In fact, maybe just to start a little bit,
Sure.
uh, uh, before we start the crucial thing, I would like to concentrate on the Gospel of Mark today. But I also present a book on the Acts of the Apostles, and I have noticed that in the past 13 years, after the publication of Richard Purvey's book, Dating Acts, the majority of scholars switched their positions from the idea that the author of Acts did not use or know or use Josephus to the position that Acts should be dated to the 2nd century after the works of Josephus. So even quite conservative scholars like Jean-Noël Aletti, a professor of the Pontifical Biblical Institute, a Catholic scholar, a Jesuit. So many scholars today switch their opinion, idea on this issue, on the use of Josephus. So we have two great scholars, Steve Mason, who first started with his book Josephus and the New Testament, and he argued that Luke, while writing the Gospel of Luke, and also Acts, but especially the Gospel of Luke, knew Josephus, and then Richard Purvey and his great Hermeneia commentary on the Acts of the Apostles. So these two scholars opened an entirely new kind of discussion concerning the use of Josephus in the Gospels and also in the Acts of the Apostles. But as I said, Steve Mason started with the idea that Luke, the evangelist, he used Josephus. But I would like to go further. I would like to go today to Mark, because Mark was earlier, and almost everyone today agrees that it was the first gospel chronologically, the Gospel of Mark. So if Mark knew Josephus, then it's almost evident that all other evangelists also used the works of Josephus. I would like to start with an entirely different way. So not with linguistics, not with verbal similarities, but with something that has never been noticed, as far as I know, by scholars, namely the general geographical scheme or outline of the Gospels. I would like to share my screen for a while and show you how I perceive the general outline of the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of John to compare them. Just for a while, I will share my screen. Here we are. We have here Paul, who concentrates in Judea, and I will explain it later what I mean by saying that Paul concentrates on Judea. Every time Paul comes to Judea, he sees there Cephas, the apostles, and Jesus' brother James. So every time he comes to Judea, he sees them, or at least meets them, or at least expects to meet them. But let's forget Paul for a while. Then we have Josephus. I refer here to his vita, his bios, his life, which is structured in the same way, in this way, that after a short introduction in Judea, Josephus goes to Galilee, is active in Galilee, and then he comes back to Judea, namely to Jerusalem. Then we have Mark, who also has the same geographical outline. After a short introduction in Judea, we have a long first part of the gospel, which takes part, which is located in Galilee, and then Jesus with his apostles, with his disciples, goes to Judea and particularly to Jerusalem. There's almost nothing else in Judea, just Jericho and then Jerusalem. Then we have Acts with a quite different geographical outline. Everything centers on Judea, and from Judea the gospel spreads to the world in a kind of waves. The journeys of Paul, 1, 2, 3, and so on. And at the end we have John and his gospel, in which we have a very different image from the Gospel of Mark. And I would like to start with this problem. In the Gospel of Mark, as I said, and everyone knows, everything starts in Galilee. Jesus lives in Galilee, the apostles live in Galilee, everything is centered around the Lake of Galilee. Like Mark calls it sea, but it's another problem. Let's say the Lake of Galilee, and then they go to Judea. In the Gospel of John, the situation is quite different. Jesus is at home in Judea, and he goes for, say, missionary journeys to Galilee, and then shortly, soon comes back to Judea, because there is a festival of the Jews. So there are some jumps, so to say, missions from Judea to Galilee. In the Gospel of John, at the baptism, the first disciples asked Jesus, "Where do you live?" And he says, "Okay, come with me." And he showed them where he lived. So he lived quite naturally in Judea, and he only went for some short trips to Galilee and then back to Judea. So we have the Gospel of Mark and we have the Gospel of John with two quite different geographical outlines of their Gospels. I will stop sharing my screen now, and then we will come back to this issue later. Okay, so this is, I would say, a contradiction in the Gospels between the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of John, which cannot be easily reconciled. And such problems were already noticed by the great scholar of antiquity, Origen, in the 3rd century. He noticed the first thing in the commentary on the Gospel of John, in his commentary on the Gospel of John, what happened after Jesus' baptism. Mark says that after Jesus' baptism, Jesus went to the wilderness, or was thrown by the Spirit to the wilderness, and he fasted for 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness. But if you read the Gospel of John, he goes to Galilee on the 3rd day. He is in Cana of Galilee, and he is married at the wedding, and he drinks wine, and there is not enough wine for the celebration, for the feast, and so on and so on. So Origen, in the 3rd century already, says it is impossible to reconcile these two ideas. Either Jesus, after his baptism, fasted for 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness, or he was glad and merry at the wedding at Cana on the 3rd day after his baptism. So Origen says how to reconcile these stories, these descriptions. And he says either one of the Gospels is true and the other is false, which he did not admit, and he said this would be a false solution to the problem, or all the Gospels are false, and this is also unreliable to him. So he said it means that the Gospels must be read in an allegorical way, not literal. And it was his solution to this problem. The discrepancy between the image of Mark and the image of John. We know that such problems exist and persist. We have, for example, the chronological problem concerning the Passover. We just celebrated the Easter this year, 2023, and everyone knows that there is a chronological discrepancy between the Synoptics and John. According to the Synoptics, Jesus died on the cross on the day of the Passover, whereas according to John, he died on the day before the Passover, on the eve of the Passover, on 14th Nisan and not on 15th Nisan. And scholars debate this problem, continue to debate this problem, I would say endlessly, because there's no easy way to reconcile the two stories. Either 15th or 14th of Nisan. So we have such problems between the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of John. What is the reason for such discrepancies? Today I would like to explain the reason for the discrepancy concerning the geographical outline. How is it possible that the Gospel of Mark tells a story of Jesus living his whole life in Galilee, and the apostles Peter, Andrew, and so on, living their whole lives in Galilee, and then coming for just a few days to Jerusalem, whereas John has a quite different image than they have. Moreover, the problem is not only with Mark, the problem is also with Paul. And this has never been noticed by scholars as far as I know. If we read Paul's letters, then the apostles live in Jerusalem for decades, always. Every time Paul comes to Jerusalem, he meets Cephas, the apostles, and James, the Lord's brother, there in Jerusalem. After 14 years, he comes again, and again he sees there Cephas, the apostles, and James, the Lord's brother. If he does not see the apostles, he is astonished. Ironically, of course, but he says, where are they? They should have been there in Jerusalem. So according to Paul, they simply lived there for decades. Moreover, he says that Cephas was not a guest in Jerusalem. He was at home in Jerusalem. Why? Because he welcomed Paul, the apostle, for 15 days, which is much longer than customary hospitality. Normally, a guest comes for 3 days only and goes away. We have such a story in Judges 19, the history of the unfaithful concubine. When the husband comes to the father-in-law, he remains there for 3 days and he wants to go back. And the hospitality is prolonged, but this is unusual. So staying with Peter for 15 days is a very long period of time, which means that Peter, Cephas, had the means. He was in a position to welcome Paul in Jerusalem, probably at his home there. So they all, both Cephas, the apostles, and Jesus' relatives, we have here James the Lord's brother, they all lived in Jerusalem. Paul has no idea of Galilee, no idea that they once lived in Galilee, but they transferred and so on and so on. They simply lived there in Jerusalem. If against this background, if we read the Gospel of Mark, we can see a great change in the geographical outline, in the geographical scheme of the whole Gospel. The change is very, very important. For Mark, everything started not in Jerusalem. Everything started in Galilee. And they lived their whole lives in Galilee. They come to Judea and particularly to Jerusalem, because there is almost nothing else in the Gospel of Mark except Jerusalem. There's only a short episode in Jericho and then immediately Jerusalem and nothing else. No Bethlehem, no Kiryat Yarim and other cities, no Lachish, or we could think of many cities there. Everything just comes to Jerusalem. And what is important that they come to Jerusalem for a few days only. Just for several days, for a few days of the Holy Week. Moreover, they do not have lodging there. They do not have a house. They do not live in a hotel, nothing like an inn or something like this. So they go out of the city for nights. They spend their nights outside the city, probably in Gethsemane or something like this, some wild area of land or something, but not in a house. So they do not have lodging in Jerusalem. Everything lasts very shortly for a few days, and then Jesus is crucified. But before his crucifixion, he tells them to go back to Galilee. And the same is repeated after his resurrection, that they should go back to Galilee and meet Jesus there. So if we read the Gospel of Mark only, no one would think that they would remain in Jerusalem for longer. Why? Especially after the crucifixion of their master, with whom they were identified, and he was crucified as a criminal. And the woman recognized Peter that he was with him. So it was a dangerous place for them, not a neutral place, it was a dangerous place. So, for what reason, in such a dangerous situation, being identified as friends of the crucified criminal, Jesus, why should have they remained in Jerusalem for decades, as we know from the letters of Paul? And I take the letters of Paul here as reliable because there is no reason for them not to be reliable in this respect. So Mark created this whole idea of coming from Jerusalem, from Galilee to Jerusalem for a few days only, uh, in a very, I would say, artificial way. It's not natural that everything happened in Galilee and they only came for a few days to Jerusalem, and then they were expected by Jesus and by the angels to go back to Galilee again. So what is the reason for such a drastic change in the geographical outline from Paul's Judea, Jerusalem, that they simply lived there for decades, to the idea that they lived in Galilee and then for the second part of the gospel, just a few days, but this is, I would say, the second part of the narrative work takes place in Jerusalem. And here we have Josephus, because in his life, in his bios, in his vita, Josephus tells a similar story. Everything happens shortly at the beginning around in Jerusalem. Then he goes for a mission to Galilee. He spends much time there around the Lake of Galilee. Again, it's very similar. He describes boats and so on, what happened in Tarihiya and so on and so on. Everything happens there around the Lake of Galilee. And then when the uprising, I would say, collapses in Galilee, he comes back to Jerusalem, and everything else, the second part of his story, autobiography, takes place in Jerusalem. So we have this geographical outline in Josephus. Again, in Josephus, it is quite natural because he was first active in Galilee, and then he comes to Jerusalem, and he spends the rest of the uprising in Jerusalem. So this is my first argument, that Mark borrowed this geographical outline of his gospel not from Paul's letters, because it contradicts Paul's letters greatly, fundamentally, but he borrowed this geographical outline of his gospel from Josephus. What for? We call it emulation. Emulation is a kind of striving to be better than the source. So if Josephus presented himself and he boasted of his own role in the uprising in the Jewish war, Mark wanted to present Jesus as being more important than Josephus. Today, for us, Josephus is just a Jewish historian. But at the time, at the end of the first century, at the beginning of the second century, Josephus was arguably the most widely known Jew in the Roman world. Today we have the whole Bible, we know Moses, David, and so on, all these stories. But let us imagine being Romans at the end of the first century. Whom could have they known as a Jew? No one. No one. Maybe Herod, maybe yes, maybe not. But Josephus was widely known because of his writings. He was the, I would say, court historian of the new dynasty, the Flavian dynasty. So he was very important for the justification of the rise of the new Roman dynasty, which came to power with Vespasian and Titus. So he was a very important propaganda man of the new dynasty. So I would say that for Roman audience, Greco-Roman audience, Josephus was the most widely known Jew of the time. So Mark, while writing his gospel about Jesus, he wanted to present Jesus as more important than Josephus. So he took the autobiography, Dios of Josephus, and modeled his story of Jesus on this pattern, according to this pattern taken from the life of Jesus. So this is the first thing. Maybe we may interrupt for a while if you have some questions or before we go to some linguistic details, because I think it's very important. As far as I know, no one has ever noticed this great discrepancy. Maybe just before we have some questions, let's shortly come to the Gospel of John to explain my first uh, first slide. Just a moment. Yes, we have it. So in Paul, there's only Judea, there's no Galilee. Josephus tells us the story about starting in Galilee and then going to Judea, especially Jerusalem. Mark has the same scheme outline, starting with Galilee and then going to Judea. And the situation changes with the Acts of the Apostles. As you will know, everything starts from Jerusalem, then it goes to Judea, then to Samaria, and then to the whole world in waves. The journeys of Paul, the missionary journeys of Paul, according to a pattern 1, 2, 3. First the Jews in the diaspora, then the Greeks, and then the church with its problems. Every journey has its programmatic speech and so on and so on. So it's very ordered, katataxin, according to an order, as Luke explained in the prologue to his gospel. And this scheme is used by John in his gospel, that everything starts in Judea. Jesus is at home in Judea, and then he only has missionary journeys to Galilee, 1, 2, 3, and so on and so on. This is one of my arguments for my presentation of the Gospel of John, the fourth Gospel, as in fact a reworking of the Acts of the Apostles. John wanted to present Acts in the pattern of the Gospel, so he incorporated the data of Acts into his Gospel. In this way, he reconciled, so Luke first reconciled Mark with Paul. And this was a problem for Luke, because Luke knew both Paul's letters and also the Gospel of Mark. And he noticed this great fundamental discrepancy between Paul and Mark concerning the geographical scheme. So it was the Lucan idea that the apostles lived in Jerusalem for decades after Jesus' resurrection. How is it possible? He does not explain it in a totally persuasive way. For example, Peter disappears in chapter 12 of the story of Acts, and then he simply reappears for an unknown reason in chapter 15 at the so-called Jerusalem Council. He is somehow present in Jerusalem again. So Luke tries to reconcile Paul with Mark by admitting that the apostles lived in Jerusalem after Jesus' resurrection. So he broke with Mark here. He did not say that they went back to Galilee. No, they remained, first praying to the Holy Spirit and then preaching and then being guests, welcomed by others, and so on and so on. And we know the story of Acts. So Luke wanted to reconcile Paul with Mark, and John wanted to reconcile the Acts of the Apostles with his gospel taken from Mark. In this way, he changed the geographical outline from the Mark one to the Lucan one, in fact, in the fourth gospel, in the Gospel of John. Okay, so now let's stop for a while, and if you have some questions let's discuss some things before we come to linguistic details.
Basically, what you're saying is that Luke is trying to reconcile the geography differences in Josephus and Mark with that of Paul.
Yes. He noticed a great problem that according to Mark, everything happens in Galilee. They only come for a few days to Jerusalem and they are expected to go back to Galilee. Whereas Paul says that Every time he went to Jerusalem, he came to Jerusalem, he met Cephas, the apostles, and James, the Lord's brother, there. So both the apostles and the relatives of Jesus. So two kinds of people, I would say, two branches of, say, early Christianity, not only the spiritual followers, but also the fleshly followers, James, the Lord's brother. So all of them were present in Jerusalem every time Paul came there. So there was no, internet at the time. So there was no satellite phones and so on and so on. So he was not. He did not write beforehand that I will come to Jerusalem. I would like to see you. No, he simply came to Jerusalem, and they simply were there. So Luke wanted to reconcile the two images by saying, "Aha! So they did not come back to Galilee after Jesus' resurrection. They remained in Jerusalem for decades, although it is difficult for him to say how is it possible. How is it possible? For example, he says that Peter went to another place. He does not want to say that he went to Antioch because, according to his image, the 12 were supposed to remain in the land of Israel, not to go outside because this was the task of Paul. So he said that Peter went elsewhere to another place, and then he simply appeared again at the so-called Jerusalem Council in chapter 15. So Luke tries to do something with this problem, explain it in some way.
How does Matthew look at this?
Matthew generally follows Mark.
Mm.
So we do not have many differences here in the Gospel of Mark and Matthew. As I argued here earlier on this channel, Matthew also takes the Acts of the Apostles as his ordering principle, as his basic text, the so-called hypertext, to his own narrative, but he does not change the Markan scheme. He makes only some relocations in the material, but they are not as drastic as they are in the Gospel of John. John changes the whole scheme to make it resemble the scheme of the Acts of the Apostles. So the center in Judea and, say, missionary journeys to other places, to Galilee and elsewhere. So this the image of John, which is also barely noticed by scholars, that it is really different from the one that we have in the Gospel of Mark. Everything starts in Judea, and Jesus simply goes for a while. For example, for the wedding of Cana, and then he immediately goes back to Judea because he needs to be there because there is another festival of the Jews, and so on and so on. So there are several journeys of Jesus to Galilee and immediately back to Judea. Okay, maybe let's start the discussing the linguistic details because they are
Sure.
also important for the Gospel of Mark. Now I will share my screen again to let you see the things. Who knows Greek will immediately notice things that are important to me now. Yes. Okay. So the first thing is the phrase Ioannes ho baptistes. In fact, this phrase Ioannes ho baptistes and the word baptistes, the immerser, the immerse. Today we translated baptizer, but baptizer is just borrowing from verbal borrowing from Greek. Let's call him immerser, from immersion people. So Ioannes ho baptistes, the very word baptistes, the immerser, only occurs in Josephus' Antiquities, again 116, and Mark 6 and 8, and only later appears in Justin dialogue. So this word baptistes and the whole phrase Johannes ho baptistes could only have been borrowed from Josephus' Antiquities. What is interesting here is that Josephus uses the word baptistes, but he also uses verbal forms like baptizo and so on and so on. And this use is also attested in Mark. So uh, this formula that I have written here is not yet a fixed formula in the Gospel of Mark. It becomes a fixed formula later in the Gospel of in the Gospel of Luke, in the Gospel of Matthew. So they already have this as a fixed, calcified, so to say, formula. Johannes Baptistes, John the Immerser. In the Gospel of Mark, it is still fluid. He can say, like in chapter 6 and 8, Johannes Baptistes, John the Immerser, but also Johannes Baptizo, for example, John the Immersing One. So in this, he also agrees with Josephus that Josephus could describe John in various ways. He could use the newly coined word. We do not know this word before the work of Josephus, so it is not attested before. I mean, in Greek literature. Uh, so it was found in Josephus, and then it is found in the Gospel of Mark in two places. So this would be very strange if the invention of this word and also this word in combination with John, the particular person of John, would be invented twice independently by Josephus and by Mark. It is implausible. So the only real solution is that someone borrowed from someone, either Josephus from Mark or Mark from Josephus. And I think that here the direction of influence is clear, that it was not Josephus who borrowed from the Gospel, but it's the Gospel who borrowed from the Gospel of Mark, which borrowed from Josephus' Antiquities. So this is the first linguistic thing, John the Immerser, Johannes Baptistes. Then we will have several proper names, and this is striking, the Gospel of Mark, that the Gospel of Mark has the same pronunciation, the same not pronunciation, sorry, the same spelling of words which are taken from Semitic languages like Hebrew or Aramaic, and the spelling is exactly the same in the Gospel of Mark and in Josephus. Also, although, as you can imagine, Semitic languages are quite different from Greek, and Semitic uh, words could have been rendered in Greek in various ways, not just this one. We have here the first example, Zebedios, Zebedee. We have this form Zebedios only in Josephus' Antiquities 533. In the story, which is Josephus' version of Joshua 7, the greedy Ahan, and I argue in my commentary on the Gospel of Mark that this is important for Mark, that the James and John are presented as greedy. They are attached to money and so on. They do not immediately follow Jesus. It is Peter and Andrew who immediately, out his, follow Jesus. They are busy with mending their nets and so on. They have hired workers. They have their enterprise and so on. They need to leave it. So they are presented in the fashion, so to say, of the greedy Aham from the Septuagint, from the Old Testament. But this version of this name, this particular spelling Zebedios, can only be found in Josephus and also in Mark. But, for example, the Septuagint renders the same Semitic word in a different way, Zambri. Not Zebedios, but Zambri. So Mark clearly took the spelling form, the particular form from Josephus' Antiquities, because it can only be found there. He didn't take it from the Septuagint, because if he took this from the Septuagint, he would have arrived at such a version of this name. But he used the version that he found in Josephus, Zebedios. And as I say, I don't want to go into details here. This was important for him, that James and John were somehow involved with money, and they are modeled on the model of Ahan from the Old Testament. Another example is Capernaum. We are used to mm, pronounce this name Capernaum and so on, Capernaum, Capernaum in our modern languages. But it is striking that this version of this name, proper name, Capernaum, can only be found in Josephus' Bellum Judaicum, the Jewish War, 3:519 only. For example, Josephus himself renders this Kafar Nahum, the Semitic, two Semitic words, Kafar Nahum, the village of Nahum, in another way in his Vita, Kafar Nokon. Moreover, Ptolemy has this version of this name, Capernaum, not with P here and not P. So this spelling, Capharnaum, can only be found in Josephus' Bellum, a Jewish war, and in the Gospel of Mark. So again, this Semitic phrase, Capharnaum, could have been rendered in various ways, and in fact it was rendered in various ways, but the rendering of Mark agrees completely with this of Josephus. Although we could imagine other ways of pronouncing this word. Another word is Bartholomeus, one of the names of the apostles, Bartholomeus. Bar is clearly, and Mark knew it, is the Aramaic word for son. Uh, Mark knew it because we have this play of names with a blind Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus. And Timaeus is the famous dialogue of Plato. So we have a play with names here in the story of the blind Bartimaeus. And then he says, Hohios to Timaeo, the son of Timaeus, in the Gospel of Mark. So Mark knew that Bar means son of. And then we have son of whom? Of Ptolemaeus. In fact, this name, Ptolemaeus, can only be found in Josephus' Antiquities 25 only. Uh, the Septuagint renders this same Ptolemy in a different way, both in Joshua, Judges, and 2nd Samuel, as Ptolemy, which is quite different from Ptolemaeus, Ptolemy. Moreover, 2nd Samuel renders this name as Ptolemy, but not Ptolemaeus. So again, the Marcan version of the name agrees verbatim with the version that we find in Josephus, Ptolemaeus, not Ptolemy, not Ptolemy, but Ptolemaeus. Another example, Gerazanoi. Gerasa was a big Hellenistic city, a great Hellenistic city, and if you have been to Jerash in Jordan, you know that it's really huge. It's the extent of the excavated area extends for more than 1 kilometer, almost a mile. So it was a great Hellenistic city. But the adjective Gerasenos or Gerasenoi in plural can only be found there in Josephus' Bellum and Antiquities, the Jewish War and Antiquities only, and in the Gospel of Mark, Gerasenoi. So we have here two examples of the plural and one example of singular, Gerasenos, but what is important is the adjective. That although the name of Gerasa was known, but the adjective Gerasenoi can only be found in Josephus and then in the Gospel of Mark. Then Decapolis. Today, all of us speak about Decapolis, but the version of this name, proper name Decapolis, can only be found in Josephus, Bellum, the Jewish War, and in the Gospel of Mark. For example, Josephus himself, in his Vita, in his Bios life, renders this name as Decapolis, high Decapolis, the 10 cities, not as one word pronounced or spelled in this name, Decapolis. One word, not Decapolis, with a plural here and high Decapolis, the 10 cities, but just Decapolis. So we have this version of the name in Josephus only and then in the Gospel of Mark. Then Bethsaida, again, uh, we have problems with the manuscripts in the Gospel of John, but let's leave it there. In the Gospel of John, there is this the same word Bethsaida, which is translated by modern scholars as Bethesda, but it's false. And again, in my commentary on the Gospel of John, I explain why do we have in the best manuscripts in Papyrus 75 and the Vaticanus, we have the strange version Bethsaida here, which is original, and I explain why is it original there. The later versions, Bethesda and so on, are clear solutions offered by copyists in later centuries. But we have this Bethsaida in the Gospel of John, but now we talk about the Gospel of Mark. We have this name, Bethsaida, in Josephus' Antiquities only, and then in the Gospel of Mark. Please note the place in which it can be found. Josephus' Antiquities, chapter 18, verse 28. It will be important later. And Mark 6, 45. Now let's go later. The same chapter of Mark 6, 53, and Josephus 18, 28. So there's the same verse in Josephus, but somewhat later in the Gospel of Mark. Another word. So they are located in Josephus in the same place, in the same verse. Gennesaret. Gennesaret. This version can be found in the Gospel of Mark, and the adjective can be found, a very similar adjective, Gennezaritis, with this T at the end. The longer version, Gennezaritis, can be found in Josephus' Antiquities, in the same place in which the word Bethsaida was found. But the Septuagint, First Maccabees, for example, or Josephus himself in his Bellum, in his war, render this name as Gennesar, a short version, Gennesar. So the longer version, Gennesaret, with at the end, and this tau here, can only be found in Josephus and again in the Gospel of Mark, in the same place, or almost the same place as we have Bethsaida. So Mark clearly took the story, the whole story from Josephus' work, and rendered it in his own Gospel, one after another. Bethsaida and then Gennesaret. And then one of the most important things, and this has already been noticed by several scholars, namely the Marcan Korban or Estindoro. Korban, which is gift. Korban, Semitic word, Korban. Keref means close to something. Lehakriv means to offer something, to bring near, to bring closer, to offer something. And this is a literal rendering of the Semitic word, letter by letter into Greek, a transliteration of the Semitic word, and an explanation. What does it mean, this Semitic word, korban, with kof, resh, bet, korban, in Hebrew? The Gospel of Mark explains ho estindoron, which is gift, and we have this in the Gospel of Mark. If we come to Josephus, we have a very similar explanation, korban, and only there we can find the transliteration of this word, korban, in the same way as we have in the Gospel of Mark, doron de tuto semaine katachelenon glota. This means semaine, tuto semaine, this means doron, gift, katachelenon glota, in the language of the Greeks. So it is these only two works in which this can be found, korban or estindoron. In fact, korban does not mean a gift. It is an offering, a sacrifice. In Leviticus, in the Septuagint, we have a different translation. For example, Dora, gifts. The translation of the Hebrew word korban is translated in a different way. So it is almost evident that Mark took this phrase korban as doron, which is not totally true, not exactly true. The translation here is not perfect, I would say, But this imperfect translation was borrowed from Josephus to the Gospel of Mark. So here the agreement is really, really close between the work of Josephus and the Gospel of Mark. Korban as doron. We do not have this transliterated word elsewhere. It's only in Josephus and in the Gospel of Mark. And then another phrase, stronio himation. Stronio means to spread. Himation is the outer garment. So we have here the story of Jesus entering Jerusalem and the Palm Sunday, and people are spreading their clothes before Jesus. The same combination of words, stronio and himation, can be found in Josephus, but with the prefix hypo, hypostronio with himation. The Septuagint here presents a different phrase, namely tithemi himation. Tithemi, it's the exact translation of the Semitic seam, to put, to lay down, to put. Whereas stronio means to spread. It's not the same. So Mark did not follow here the Septuagint, the putting or laying down of the clothes. He rather followed Josephus, which renders the same story about Jehu as a new king, and the people who spread, not put down, not laid down, but spread their clothes before the new king, shouting, Jehu is king, Jehu is king. So Mark used here the version not from the Septuagint, but the version of Josephus, and it influenced his own gospel. People shouting, Hosanna, the new king, and the kingdom of God is coming. So the Jehu revolution here came true in Jesus' entry to Jerusalem. Then another word, Sadducaioi. Again, precisely this rendering, this spelling, can only be found in Josephus and in Mark, and later Gospels in Justin and so on. As you can imagine, this is a Semitic word. Tzaddik means a righteous one, the just one, tzaddik. So you could render a Semitic word, tzaddik. We have the movement of tzaddiks in Poland, in 18th century Poland, and so on. Up to now, if you go to various places in Poland, we have this traditions of tzaddikim. So tzadducaioi, the righteous ones, the just ones. But the rendering, the spelling is exactly the same in Josephus and in Mark. Moreover, it is combined with the idea that they believe in no resurrection and they only rely on the law, the Mosaic law or laws. So we only have this word, particular spelling, and this combination with no resurrection law in Josephus and in the Gospel of Mark. So, okay. And then the final thing is Pilatus. Pilatus, the name which we also know, for example, from the inscription which was found at Caesarea. So the name itself, Pilatus, is known from other sources as well. And rendering in Greek as Pilatus, there's nothing strange, nothing exceptional. But he is introduced in the story of Mark as someone who is evident in, so how to say it, that he appears in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 15, as someone well known. He's not introduced in any particular way, as though the reader was expected to know who Pilate was. In fact, probably Mark assumed that the readers would know who Pilate was. Although the readership of the Gospel of Mark is identified with Greece, with Rome, so how is it possible that someone reading the Gospel of Mark immediately knew who Pilate was? For us, it's obvious because we learned the story of Jesus from our childhood, but for them, how is it possible to know who Pilate was? And they took him to Pilate. Who was Pilate? Who was Pilatus? So He is introduced in Josephus' Antiquities as the follower of his predecessor, as a procurator of Judea, although he was a prefect of Judea, but this is another thing. For example, in 1 Timothy, he is identified as Pontius Pilatus, the Pontius Pilate. So there is another adjective which clarifies the meaning of Pilate, who he was. Whereas he's introduced in a narrative way in Antiquities, and in the Gospel of Mark, the reader is supposed to know who he was. For example, Herod is introduced as king and so on. John is introduced as immerser. Everyone is somehow introduced, whereas Pilate simply appears in the story as someone evident. So this is another argument that Mark knew the work of Josephus. Moreover, he assumed that the readers of his gospel would also know the work of Josephus. Okay, so now let's stop sharing my screen. And these are the linguistic arguments for the knowledge of the works of Josephus by Mark. As you could notice, there's the longer phrase which is peculiar to them, korban, or tindoron, korban, which is a gift, which is not true, in fact. And then there are many proper names whose spelling is exactly the same in the works of Josephus and in the Gospel of Mark. Although, knowing Semitic languages, we could render these words in various possible ways, not only this particular one, which we find in the Gospel of Mark.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. I find it convincing. I really
Thank you. It's great. I hope that our viewers will also find it convincing.
Because back then, like there are other, I know that there are other scholars that also think Mark knew Josephus, but there's not many. And back then, before I knew anything about this, I wondered. Well, scholars are saying Luke Acts knew Josephus, and John is 2nd century as well, and he postdates Luke Acts. Well, what if Mark and Matthew did too? Something I
Now we
wondered
have
about
to,
back then.
yeah, now we ask the question why. And I try to answer this question in the first part of my talk today, that Mark not only knew the works of Josephus, but he wanted to use the details from the works of Josephus to present Jesus as someone much more important than the well-known Josephus. So it was not simply the case of borrowing, it
Right.
was also the case of emulating. We have here the most important Jew of the whole universe, so to say. Not Josephus, forget him. Let's take his persona, his biography, but now let's concentrate on Jesus. And the knowledge of the realities of Palestine, which is not great in the Gospel of Mark, as you probably know. So all the details, almost all the details, like proper names, the name of Gennesaret, and so on, were taken from Josephus. So the story, which it's highly symbolic, because today we know, in contrast to the scholars who lived 100 years ago, today we know that the Gospel of Mark is highly symbolic. It's not just a simple narrative. Everything is symbolic there. For example, I mentioned Galilee, the Lake of Galilee. Luke calls it Lake of Galilee, like Josephus does. Everyone who has been there knows that it's a lake, it's not a sea. But Mark uses the word thalassa, which means a sea, because he wants to present the sea as the Mediterranean Sea. And the journey to the other side of the sea is the journey to the other side of the Mediterranean Sea. And on the other side of the sea, there are Gentiles, pagans, strange people like Cyclops from Homer's Odyssey, and so on and so on. So there is a great cultural change by going to the other side of this sea. But if you go there to Galilee, it's just a few miles, and nothing changes. In fact, so the change in the gospel. So Mark is a highly symbolic narrative, but he took the details, his knowledge of the realities of Palestine, mainly from Josephus. I myself once asked myself a question: what is not taken from Jesus? And there are really few uh, names, I talk about proper names now, which are not taken from Josephus. For example, Dalmanuta, and this is not Semitic because it has four consonants: Dalet, Lamet, Mem, Nun, and Te at the end. So it's not typically Semitic, Dalmanuta. Uh, the problem is with Magdala, Mary Magdalene, whether this is today everyone says that we discovered Magdala and there are excavations in Magdala, but is it really Magdala or not? Tarihi, for example, is another problem. The things that are excavated there, and what's the name of this place which is excavated. So there are a few names which can be found in the Gospel of Mark which are not borrowed from Josephus, but there are really few. um, and I think maybe they also have some symbolic overtones, like Magdala, Mary the Magdalene. So the word Magdala itself never appears in the Gospel of Mark. It's only the adjective Magdalene, and Gadol means great, so Magdalene maybe has some symbolic meaning. And what is also important, I noticed this here briefly, that Mark, in contrast to our previous ideas, he knew at least some basic elements of Semitic languages, because he was capable of creating wordplays. For example, with this Bar Ptolemaeus, Bar Timaeus, the son of Timaeus, and he himself explained that Bar Timaeus is a son, Bar is a Hios of Timaeus, and Timaeus, everyone who learned a little bit about philosophy and Greek literature knows the name of Timaeus, and so on. So he was capable of creating such wordplays with Nazarenos, for example, as the son of David. That Nazareth is Netzer, and Netzer appears in Isaiah 11, that the sprout of Jesse, and so on and so on. So Mark knew at least some basic elements of the Semitic languages. So he could use the data of Josephus, but he also rephrased them in his own way, creating his beautiful gospel, creating this geographical outline to suit the model of Josephus, and also he took the many details from Josephus to make some local flavor, so to say, to his highly symbolic story of the church.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.